Troy Salazar is the founder of Liberty Self-Directed Learning Center in West Des Moines, Iowa. Troy worked in public schools for 22 years, first as a second grade teacher in a rural community in Iowa, and later in the Des Moines public schools, where he spent most of his teaching career. He launched Liberty Self-Directed Learning Center last fall, in the fall of 2022, with about a dozen learners, ages 5 to 14. Liberty is part of the Liberated Learners global network of self-directed learning centers modeled after North Star Self-Directed Learning for Teens, a microschool learning center in Western Massachusetts that was founded in 1996 by Ken Danford, who's been on this podcast. I'm a huge fan of Ken's work in not only being one of the original microschool founders and creating North Star, but then moving on to create the Liberated Learners Network to bring in a group of education entrepreneurs, including Troy, to really provide more opportunities, more education options around self-directed education for learners around the world. So Troy Salazar, welcome to the Liberated podcast.
Thank you very much, Carrie. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm a big fan of your work, and I'm just excited to have a chat with you.
I'm really excited to have a chat with you. I, again, just love the work of Liberated Learners and obviously love to personally spread the message of self-directed education and help more families discover what non-coercive self-directed learning looks like, some of the benefits of that. So it'd be great to hear your experience of founding and launching Liberty. But before we get into that, I'd love to hear more about what prompted you to get into education in the first place. Why did you enter teaching and teach in the public schools 22 years ago?
Yeah. So I guess two things probably would sum up my decision to pursue the career that I did. And one is I always liked being with the kids and working with kids. I was always good with them. And I think the other part is that I was a good student. I was a really good student. You know, I learned how to play the game and I played it well. And I think those two things after graduation from high school, I thought, well, I dabbled in some other things, but ultimately was just drawn to it. I'll just be a teacher. I was good at it. It's familiar and I like kids. So let's go that route. And I did. And no regrets. I had a great time doing it. And so here I am.
And you have an interesting perspective in the public schools, first working in a rural public school community and then spending most of your career in an urban area in Des Moines. What were the differences there? Yeah,
so I graduated from a high school. My graduating class was 62 kids, and that was 4 towns. So it was a very small district, and that's what I was familiar with. So out of college, I was kind of looking for something similar. And I think I was scared of the big city of Des Moines. I got a second grade teaching position in Earlham, Iowa. And, there was 2 sections of second grade and I taught there for 2 years. It was great. It was a K-12 building. So I really loved the family kind of, everybody's got your back kind of camaraderie that they had there. It was special. It was a special place. And so I felt at home there. And then after teaching for 2 years, I thought, I feel like I need to do something different. I didn't know if it was just the grade level or if I was really wanted to be a teacher or what. So I took a year off. I traveled to Australia and just did some traveling and just maybe trying to find myself a little bit. And then after that year, I came back and I got on at Des Moines Public Schools as a special ed teacher. And then I started my urban setting, much different than the small town of Earlham, Iowa, I'll tell you that. But I'm glad I did both. I'm glad I did both because it's just a good experience to see both sides of it. I grew up and I went through the system in a rural community school district, but then to teach in one and then to teach in the urban setting, I think it gave me a good perspective of all the different facets of it.
So you spent over 20 years in this conventional public school classroom. At what point did you start thinking about alternative education and specifically self-directed education? What was your entry point there?
Man, I don't think it was it was not until the very end, but I think there were signs and symptoms. And what I mean by that is I did a lot of bouncing around the system. So I started off as a second grade teacher, like I said. And then when I joined Des Moines Public Schools, I started off as a special education teacher. I did that for a couple of years. And then I went and got my master's for counseling. And so I was a high school guidance counselor at a high school for about 4 years. And then I went back into special education. There were several different things. I was a gifted and talented consultant for a while. I had a great experience working with behavior disordered kids at a middle school. And, I don't know, I guess in all those positions, I don't know if I was just looking for something better, quote unquote, but it just seemed like everywhere I turned, it wasn't working. And maybe just the constant wanting to try something new was like, well, maybe this department is working better, or maybe I'll be happy there. And I think ultimately, there was just too many unhappy kids, I think. And I remember saying to people and to colleagues and just friends, I was like, man, it's 2017 or it's 2020. Why haven't we figured this out yet? Why are there so many unhappy kids? It just blew my mind. It's like, you would think that we'd have something that was in place, that was worked, and we just got really good at it. But what I found is that every couple of years, there's this new thing. And all of the teachers were expected to get on board. And we always did, because all teachers are good students, most. And so we got on board and we gave it our all. And then a new administration would come in and they had the newest, the best practice, or the new gadget, or the new curriculum. And it was just continuous. And I was like, oh, nobody knows really what's working. And I never thought to look at the system. It was always, well, they're bad kids, or they're bad parents, or that's a bad teacher, or I got to entertain them more. It was always something that it was never the system's fault. And then there were several times in that last few years where I was like, I can't do this anymore. I'm not happy. I'm not seeing happy kids. And then in my last year, I was seriously considering, I got to move on to something else. And I was talking seriously to my wife about it. And there was a sub shortage in Des Moines, like there is everywhere. And so my department got called upon to do some subbing. And I was in one of those subbing positions. And I called my wife and I said, honey, the idea of our grandkids being in this classroom scares me. And I wasn't exaggerating or being dramatic. And it was nothing that the kids were doing. It was the response that the kids were having to the system. They were so checked out, and I was like, this is not the way it's supposed to be. And so I started to talk to my wife about what else can I do? Well, then I was in my car listening to a podcast, and I heard the little fisherman story from Sudbury Valley School, right? That the little kid who fished from 9 to 13 for 4 years. And I thought, what in the heck is going on at this school? So I got to my office that day and I looked it up, and I was all in. I got goosebumps. I called my wife. I said, look this up. And it's almost like, how did I not know about this model? How did I not know about this? How'd this get by me? And I think, no regrets again. I think I wasn't ready yet. And I think all of my time in the system was coming to a head. And I think a greater power knew that I was about to leave. And so it was time to introduce me to this. And I was introduced to it through this story of Sudbury Valley. And I was just hooked. And I was talking to my wife. I said, well, maybe there's one around here. So I started doing research, and I started getting books, and I started reaching out. And that's when I reached out and found the folks that were going to do Sunrise. And it just took off. And my wife was like, well, look, I mean, if you think this is going to make you happy and you want to give it a try, let's do it. And so she was just crazy enough to go along with it. And God's been good to us. And so I was able to step out and make this move. I think a lot of teachers who are unhappy in the system just can't afford to do it. But my wife's done pretty well for herself, so we could take this risk. And so she's been nothing but supportive. And so we dove in, and we started the journey, and it's been a ride, I'll tell you what.
Oh, it's amazing. There's so much there. We'll start with the power of podcasting. I love that you were in your car listening to a podcast and hear the fishing story. I'd recommend listeners and viewers read Free at Last by
Yep.
Sudbury Valley School co-founder Daniel Greenberg, where he details that story as just one example of self-directed education that's following a child's interests and passions and with kind of no agenda of what children will learn and when and how, and then seeing their kind of natural development. So that's
Right.
great. My listeners will also know that 3 of my kids attend Sudbury Valley School. And of course, I'm a huge advocate of self-directed education. So I love that that was your entry point with Sudbury Valley, and then discovering the Liberated Learners Network and Ken. So you also mentioned that you reached out to Nick Locken, who was the former high school physics teacher who tried to launch, along with his wife, the Sunrise Sudbury School in Des Moines. And I've had Nick on the podcast earlier this year, wrote an article in Forbes about his ordeal trying to get a Sudbury model school opened in Iowa. And Iowa, as I've said previously, is one of the most difficult states in the country to launch a private school. There's all kinds of barriers to entry for private school founders, including accreditation requirements that really create a lot of gates, a lot of barriers for these entrepreneurs that kind of protect traditional incumbent models of education and keep out more experimental or learner-driven education models like the Sudbury model. So interesting that you reached out to him. I'm curious what that conversation was like and how you went from kind of connecting with him about the Sudbury model to then finding Liberated Learners.
Yeah. So originally I wanted to do a Sudbury. And so I was happy to discover that Sunrise was there. And I think, if my memory serves me correctly, I don't think they had posted that they couldn't do it yet at that point. Maybe they had, but when I reached out to him, I was like, this is great. And then they were by that time, they were pretty defeated and deflated. And I understand why. I think they put a lot of effort into it. They were hopeful, and just to kind of have their dream, ended was kind of sad. And 2 things, I guess. One was, I felt like the Sudbury model was probably going to be even a harder sell to the community here in Des Moines, in the Midwest, than Liberated Learners. And this was a conversation that we went back and forth with my wife. I guess we really liked the idea of Liberated Learners as far as having the board and just kind of the options, the classes, and just these are available. Everything's optional still, but here's some things if you want it. Where I felt like maybe the Sudbury model is a little bit even more extreme, if you will, in the eyes of most folks who only know the conventional system. So just kind of seeing what their experience had come to, and believing that maybe the Liberated Learners model was a little more palatable to our community, we kind of went that route. But again, like I said to you, originally I was going to be for teens. And so as we kind of progressed through the year, and I didn't get as many teens as I'd hoped, I kind of had to fall back on, because a lot of the Liberated Learner centers are teens. There's a couple in our 12 or 13 centers that do have smaller kids, younger kids, but most of them are for teens. And so I kind of had to reach outside of the Liberated Learners, and I actually did do some consulting with some Sudbury schools about, hey, how do you kind of operate? Because I can't operate Liberty SDLC here in West Des Moines as a North Star program when I don't have the teens, because it seems like, and it was refreshing to hear from some of the folks that I was talking to with that do the Sudbury model. It was refreshing to hear from them. Look, most kids are going to play, socialize, kind of go fly by the seat of their pants all day long, and that's okay. Usually about 13, 14, they'll start to grab on to more of an interest or a liking and kind of pursue it more diligently, and maybe be interested in some of your classes. But while we still tried to offer classes and had a board, this is going to be offered at this time, it just doesn't work very good with these younger kids. And so it was getting the point, just being comfortable with that. And so I think that's where me talking to the Sudbury folks really helped me. So we're really kind of, while we are in Liberated Learners, we're kind of a hybrid. And I think a lot of centers are, we're just trying to make it work with our population that we have.
Right. You're responding to the community that's around you and their needs. Yeah.
Right. Exactly. So yeah, we're just trying to make it work.
Yeah, so let's talk a little bit about the structure of Liberty and then the Liberated Learners Network more generally. Unlike most Sudbury schools, which are typically recognized as K-12 mixed age private schools, that's again what Nick was hoping to build with the Sunrise Sudbury School that was not able to be launched because the Department of Education in Iowa wouldn't allow that. Unlike that, Liberated Learners Networks are typically resource centers for homeschoolers, people who are recognized as homeschoolers in their state, and then they can use the Liberated Learners Resource Center, or in your case, Liberty Self-Directed Learning Center, as a resource, coming part-time or full-time, depending on their needs. As you mentioned, there are classes that are offered, but everything is optional. There's mentoring and kind of coaching and advising where young people can meet with the adult facilitators periodically to kind of talk about their goals and interests. So tell us a little bit about the kind of homeschool community then in Des Moines. Are you finding that, again, I know you're only going into your second year, but of the dozen students that you have they have they been homeschooling previously? Are they new to homeschooling? Kind of what are those families like?
Yeah. So before I do that, you make a good point. So while Iowa has really tough accreditation laws, we have some of the best and most flexible, friendly homeschooling laws. So it's just a matter of, to homeschool in Iowa, you just have to call up your office manager at your assigned school and say, we've got it from here. Thank you. And that's it. So we take advantage of that and encourage our families just to do that. And then, like you said, we're just a homeschooling resource. So that's really the easiest, the path of least resistance, if you will. So yeah, I'm sure it's not foreign to you to know, but I think it's worth mentioning that I think right off the bat, people will think, well, the homeschooling population is the target population. And I think if you talk to anybody in the Liberated Learners networks, you'll find out, well, you would think that, but it's actually a smaller percentage than what you would believe as far as membership in some of these centers. And I think that might be because a lot of homeschoolers, I think, do like traditional homeschooling, and they follow a curriculum, and if they're already homeschooling, then they've got it taken care of, so to speak. But we do have some homeschooling families. Some have always homeschooled. Some have only recently started homeschooling. I think COVID was a I don't want to say a good thing, but it helped our cause. I think it gave parents and families a peek behind the curtain, so to speak, of the conventional system. And some families decided to do another way. So we have families that have always been in conventional school and have now joined us. And I'm happy to say that 2 of them are coming back. And then we've had families that have homeschooled for the most part, and then are joining us full-time, and then some that are joining us part-time. And I think that part-time homeschooling membership is probably going to be more and more popular with us. It seems like that's who I'm getting interest from. Before we started recording, I mentioned to you, and I'll mention again, that it seems like a lot of families can see the shortcomings of the conventional system, and there's a gap between that and our SDE model. Right. And I think a lot of our homeschooling families who are coming part-time are comfortable with 2 or 3 days with what we're doing. And we'll take it, right? We'll take it. And I think what I'm finding is a big part of the work here is educating the community on what our model is, because it is a complete opposite of the conventional system. And when you talk to people, sometimes they look at you like you're crazy. Now today I had a family come in. She has 3 little kids, and her oldest is going to be 6. And she was refreshing to talk to, because it's not every day that I get to talk to somebody who really gets it and is really open to the model. And she was open to the model. So that's encouraging and refreshing for me. Because a lot of times I'll talk to families and they're like, well, how do they learn math? You know, just all the standard questions. How do they learn to read and all that stuff. But we're going to keep up the good work, and it's one family at a time.
So what do you say to those families, Troy, right? Because you were in that conventional system for so long. And as you said, it really wasn't until later in your career as a public school teacher that you started to say, wait a minute, maybe it is the system itself that's problematic. Maybe there is another way. So in some ways, you can relate to those parents and those families who are skeptical of not only leaving the public system, but then moving towards self-directed education, where this is not curriculum driven, where it's really up to the child to drive their own learning. So what do you say to those parents?
Oh man, it just varies. I think, as you probably know, it all depends on your audience, right? It depends on your audience and your environment. If I have somebody who's come to this building, who's come to the building and is talking to me, I know that they're genuinely interested, right? And they care and they want to know, and maybe we can have a deep conversation. But even in that conversation, I'm still kind of listening, getting their cues on, are they buying this, or am I pushing too hard, or all that. But so it just depends, you know. And then I think I just start by saying, look, you know, I was in the system for 22 years and I was at the peak of my earnings. I had great benefits. I had a great retirement, and I could see I wasn't happy and the kids weren't happy. And I would argue that even for the kids that it appears to work for, it's not what's best for them. And I use myself as an example. And then there's just so many avenues, as you know, that you can take this discussion. And I just give them little, I try not to get too preachy, but I get fired up and then I just can't stop talking. But you just try to, you try to give out little bits of information and see how they respond to it. And if they're going to dig their heels in the sand, then I'm, you know, that's one thing. If they're really like, oh, that makes sense. Yeah. Or sometimes I'll say, we all know somebody who's not happy in school. Let's talk about that kid. And they'll tell me about that kid and I'll point some things out. And a lot of times I'll use the story about when I worked in a BD classroom, a behavior disordered classroom. And I would talk about those kids, and I see them now in a new light, because whereas I used to might think of them as they had bad parents or they're bad kids or yada, yada, yada. Now it's, wait a minute. They're like a wild stallion and they didn't want to be tamed, right? We should be applauding them for that. Like they're not going to be forced into this system. That doesn't make them a bad person or a bad kid. That doesn't make their parents bad. It's just, why won't the system flex to their needs? And this system's never going to do that. And so I just try to bring some humanity, I guess, to the conversation and not be too pushy. And hopefully, you know, I'd like to think that most of them walk away questioning some things, maybe. And I think it's just like anything else, when you're learning something new and maybe that seems drastic, you either, you know, that guy's crazy, or you sit with it a minute and you're like, maybe there's something there. And then they, you know, I'll offer them some different resources to look at if they want. And then, yeah, we just do what you can.
So take us into a day in the life or a week in the life of Liberty Self-Directed Learning Center. And over the past year, what does learning look like? What is the day experience for the learners that are in your space?
Right. So it depends on the day. This past year, Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Fridays were our busiest days. That's when we had most of our kids. So on Tuesdays, we had our community meeting at about 10 a.m. And we borrowed a lot of this from the Sudbury model. We try to be as democratic as we can. And again, we have kids that are about a dozen kids ages 5 to 14. And so we would, at our community meeting, it would last anywhere from 15 to 45 minutes, depending. At the start of the year, things are a little bit more, the meetings are a little longer because a lot of times we do everything from share and tell in there to any community concerns, to ideas for field trips, to classes or interests, or just all kinds of stuff like that. So that was Tuesday. On Thursdays, we had our cooking class. That was popular. And so that was popular with the kids. And then we have a park that's 2 blocks away. So we often went to that when the weather was permitting, and sometimes when weather wasn't permitting. We just have a lot of, mingling. We have a music class that one of my parents teaches a music class to both our students. And then she's got some homeschooling families that come from throughout the community and join us on that day. That's on Tuesday afternoons, or was this past year. So it's just, every day is a little bit different. Some kids, they're playing video games, they're playing board games. Sometimes they're reading, sometimes they might be watching a movie, listening to some music. We got a little gymnast in the room. So in our group, so there was a lot of gymnastics going on, some choreography. Rollerblading was big this year. We have some music in the back, like I talked about. You just never know what's going on. There's a lot of fantasy play. That brings me to this. So I had to do some deschooling myself, after 22 years as a teacher, and then also my whole experience in the system as a student. That's a long time to think what learning and education is supposed to be. And so I talked to and was talked to about the deschooling process, and I tried to catch myself in those moments. And so I had to go through that process myself. And I think what I ultimately, probably the biggest takeaway is I looked at play in a new perspective. And probably a lot of the readings that I did from Peter Gray helped me with this. And, I used to think that play was just recess. It's just a break from learning. But then when you let kids play all day long and you try to look at it differently from a new lens or new perspective, you're like, oh, wait a minute. There's so much learning going on in this play, especially when adults are not leading the play. So like you would have 8-year-olds trying to convince 12-year-olds of a new rule in the fantasy game that they made up, right? And sometimes they were successful and sometimes they weren't. And just the nonstop negotiating and trying to convince and to advocate for oneself, and the constant conflict resolution that's taking place. So there's all these little little learning opportunities in the play. And so I try to point that out to parents too. And I'm just rambling on again, but yeah, it just varies day to day. It depends on how many kids are here too. Mondays and Wednesdays seem to be a little more quiet. So those are days where there might be some reading going on. Somebody might be nestled up with a book or a video game, or the craft table was big with a couple of our girls. All kinds of stuff.
So I want to shift gears just a bit and talk a little bit about policy, because Iowa earlier this year became one of the first of now 7 states in 2023 to introduce or expand their school choice programs to be universal school choice programs, meaning open to all K-12 students in the state. And Iowa joined Arizona, that in 2022 became the first U.S. state to create a universal education choice program, an education savings account program that enables education funding to follow students instead of going to school systems, and enables families to kind of broadly define education and use these dollars for the kind of educational experience that they want for their kids. And so if Liberty Self-Directed Learning Center was in Arizona or in Utah, another state this year that passed a universal education savings account program, any family that wanted to would be able to use their ESA dollars to attend Liberty as a homeschool resource center, a microschool that's that's already low cost and more accessible to more families due to your low tuition. I believe your tuition is about $10,000 a year for a full-time option, but a lot of families come part-time. The Utah ESA is around $8,000. Similar in Arizona, I think a little bit less. So families would be able to access Liberty. Now, Iowa passed a universal ESA, but just as it's difficult in Iowa to launch a private school, it's also not possible currently for Iowa families to use their ESA money, which is roughly $7,600 a year per student, to attend Liberty. They have to use that at an accredited private school. And as I mentioned earlier, there's already these hoops to just open a private school, whether or not you wanted to receive any kind of school choice funding as a result of that. What is your sense about that?
I guess I was hopeful, but I wasn't overly hopeful that we would qualify. And I've had a lot of families say, hey, can we use this? Does this qualify? And unfortunately, I have to tell them, no, it doesn't. Not yet, is what I tell them. And I think on one hand, I'm hopeful that, baby steps, right? It's all baby steps. And I think this was a step in the right direction as far as for our families and our communities to look for education that works for their kids and their families as they see fit. And I like it. I'm a supporter of it. Maybe in time we'll qualify. That's the best we can do. And until then, we're going to do the best we can without it. I do worry a little bit about, when it does, if and when we do qualify, what kind of strings does that come with? So I don't know. Hopefully none, but you never know. As soon as you start accepting government money, it gets a little dicey. So, we'll see in time. And until that day comes, then we're just going to do our best to fundraise and make it affordable for families. We got some families that pay very little, and we got some families that pay all, just like most of the Liberated Learner centers in our network. So we will wait and see.
Yeah, and I think you're right. I think this was an important first step. I think it's great that Iowa has launched this universal ESA and hopefully can create a culture of parental choice in education. And I just hope that that there is also this attention to the kind of supply side that goes along with the demand now from parents. Obviously, thousands of parents have already signed up to participate in this program. They want to be a part of the school choice program. And currently, there's really not enough supply to meet that demand. And of course, part of that limited supply is due to these sort of regulations or barriers, not only for private school founders, but even for more student-led part-time or homeschooling programs, micro schools, and so on, like yours,
Right.
that's artificially limiting the supply of available options for families and innovative options for families. Really, a lot of families, I'm sure, like you and the ones that you've talked to, are dissatisfied with conventional schooling, either conventional public school or conventional private school, and they want something totally different. You're providing that, and of course, kudos to you for making it as accessible financially as possible. But yeah, it must be frustrating when you look to your neighbors in Arizona and Utah and say, gee, parents there, they can access this program.
Yeah, it sure is, Carrie. And I think, it's almost like our model's too different because if you have to be accredited, you have to get the government's blessing. And in order to get the government's blessing, you're going to teach this much curriculum. And so you're still inside that box, just like if you go from a public school to a private school, you're still inside that box of you're being told what's important, right? And you're being told that whatever you're into, you can do that on the weeknights and weekends. But while you're here on our watch, you're going to be doing what we think is important, which is this amount of history, science. And so, yeah, I guess I applaud the state for taking that first step. I hope it's not the last.
Yeah, and just to put a fine point on this, back to Sunrise Sudbury School, they just wanted to open as a private school. This was well before school choice policies were introduced in Iowa. They, had no intention at the time of being involved in a school choice program. They just wanted to hang up their shingle and run a private school for anybody who wanted to join, and were barred from doing that. So just these gatekeepers preventing education entrepreneurs from operating. But, I'm hopeful. It sounds like you are too. Obviously, we have to be vigilant and we have to worry about overregulation and encroaching regulation. But I'm curious, are you hopeful? What do you see not only as the future of American education, particularly as someone who's had your foot in both parts of education, kind of inside the system and now entirely outside of the system? And then the second part of that question is, what do you see as the future of self-directed education? Do you feel like interest in this alternative model will continue to grow?
Yeah, I think, man, it's just, I wish parents could see even more what's going on in conventional schools. Public conventional schools, we'll start there. It's just, they've got issues, and I think sometimes districts and administrators try to sugarcoat things and make it appear that it's something that it's not. And unfortunately, you get families and parents who, well, I went through it, and so you have to, it's just, well, something we all have to do, which is sad that it's gotten to that point. But then even if you get into a private school, you're still not outside, like I mentioned, you're still not outside of that box. So it's still putting kids' interests secondary to what somebody else thinks is important. I think it's cracking more and more. And I don't think that, it's just not going to improve. It's not better teachers. It's not better parenting. It's not more money. None of those things are going to fix it. They've been trying to throw that stuff at it for years. And I think it's just going to get worse, unfortunately. And I think we're seeing it with anxiety rates in teens and suicide and depression and just, I was just talking to somebody today too about just the mere fact that we send 18-year-olds on to college, not knowing who they are or what they want to be there for. And they're going just because they think it's the next step on the conveyor belt. And then they just pick something, get a degree in it, and then a lot of times end up doing something else that has nothing to do with their degree because they don't know who they are, what they're into. And so that alone, I think, is a crime that we're doing to our young people. But I don't think it's going to get any better. And I think it's going to continue to get worse. I think ultimately with SDE in our future, I think we're going to see more and more unschooling. I think we're going to see more and more just these kind of recipes of different options, like I see that, like I'm starting to see from some of the families that are coming to me. I keep them home on 2 days a week. I send them here on this day. I go to this co-op on that day. I want to send them to you on this day and that day. And just kind of using our community as our classroom and the experts in our communities as our teachers. And I think more and more families are going to turn to that. So I am hopeful. I'm a little concerned about because a lot of these centers, a lot of the Sudbury Valley places are not in the Midwest. I know there's one in Chicago. I know there's another center in the Liberated Learners Network that just opened in Illinois. But there's not a lot in the Midwest here. And sometimes I try not to let my thoughts go there, but sometimes I think, man, are we a little early here? I think the buzz is here. I know that families are looking for something different, but there's conventional school and seeing the problems of that and wanting something different, right? And then there's this gap to where we are with the SDE model, and it's a big gap. And so I think sometimes families will come to me they want the conventional system. They want the curriculum and the classes. They just want it on a smaller, safer, intimate level. And that's just not what we are. And I don't want to be that. And so I think the door is open, but it's just open a little bit. And I think it's only going to get more and more open as more and more podcasters come out like this. I like to feel like I'm kind of breaking ground here in Des Moines, Iowa, and just trying to get the word out. It's refreshing, one, to talk to a mom of 3 young kids saying, I get it. I support you. I follow you. I promote you. Thank you. It's refreshing and encouraging to go through we did the West Des Moines 4th of July parade last week or a couple weeks ago. And it's refreshing to hear people like, oh, I heard about that school. I want to check that out, and I want to say we're not a school, but so the word is spreading. And I think it's just going to be one family at a time. As cliche as that sounds, it's just one person at a time. It's one conversation at a time. And when I do podcasts like this, and I can get this out to our community and get one person to talk to about it at another at a pool party, or, it's just spreading the word. And I think it's good work. It was a financially painful year for my wife and I this year, because like I said, we don't turn any family away. So we had to dig into our own savings a little bit to make ends meet this year. We're hopeful that we can make ends meet next year. But, how long do you do that? If you're like, okay, we tried, and so is it 2 years? Is it 3 years? But we'll see. We're coming back next year. We're going to do everything we can to promote ourselves and to get the word out there and to educate families, and we shall see.
Yeah, and that's so great and wonderful that you are a pioneer in the Midwest for self-directed education and spreading the word, as you say, about the value of this educational philosophy and approach. And I think you're right that the sustainability piece, particularly when you are trying to make your program as accessible as possible to most families, is tricky. And that's, again, where well-crafted school choice policies that provide that kind of maximum flexibility, that broad definition of education, maximum parental choice, can really make programs like yours more accessible to the families that want it. So I wish you well there. Last question, Troy, why Liberty? Why name your program Liberty?
It was intentional. Yeah, it was almost like that was from the beginning. That word was just in my head. And then I found the perfect font for it. And it's just liberty, man. It's freedom, right? It's just get out of our business and let us educate our kids and let our kids educate themselves the way they want. And I think it just says it all. It just says it all. And my wife came up with the tagline, education designed by you. And so that's kind of our little tagline. And I think it's just perfect. And what is more American than liberty, right? In your education. So we got the little blue star on top of the I, and it just came together nicely.
Just perfect.
Yeah.
So the website is libertysdlc.com. It's Liberty Self-Directed Learning Center in West Des Moines, Iowa. And Troy Salazar, thank you so much for being on the Liberated podcast.
Terry, it was a pleasure talking to you. I appreciate your work and everything that you're doing for our cause. Sincerely, thank you.